Thank you everybody for coming to this new session of the webinar about blue justice. We today welcome Melina KOURANTIDOU. She's an economist and she's working in the laboratory AMUR for a postdoc. She's a specialist about Arctics and she worked for a long time now about the natural resources in the Arctic region. And so this morning, she will present us her work about equity consideration in the northern fisheries and how this exploitation of the natural resources is shared between the different actors. So I hope that I introduce you correctly, Melina, and if you want to begin, I leave you the floor now.
Yeah, thank you, Betty, for this detailed introduction. I have nothing to add to that, so I'll jump straight onto my presentation. Good. So, as part of this equity series talk, I'll be presenting a combination of case studies that draw from the following work. So, first, there's a paper published in Frontiers in Marine Science on equity indicators for fisheries allocations in Canadian Arctic communities. That was published in 2021. Then a paper with an international team of co-authors on the distribution of new fishing opportunities in northern waters. And last and very shortly, a paper that's currently under review on strong user rights in the snow crab fishery, which is part of my currently funded project here at UBO, the AWAIT project, Arctic Waters at Stake from Alien Invasive Species Threats. I've actually never given this talk before. The writing of the first paper largely coincided with the pandemic. And the second paper is just being finalized now, and the third one is just about ready for dissemination. It's currently in review. So naturally, you'll hear me talk more about the first paper. So in the abstract, I promised you for this talk that this will be structured around three key dimensions. And the first one is the spatial dimension, the temporal and historical dimension, and the one that has to do with strengths of user rights in marine conservation. And so in the first paper on equity indicators for Inuit fishing communities, the main equity-related arguments are basically past injustices, colonization, and adjacency of the resource, meaning proximity to the marine resource. And in the second paper, we get all three dimensions where we see that historical rights matter in how you distribute fishing rights, but are not necessarily fair or efficient. And we see that the movement of species northwards and the appearance for the first time of new commercial stocks triggers equity challenges, and the strength of user rights dimension comes into play, tied to, say, for example, ITQs, individual transferable quotas, versus other systems perceived as more equitable. And then in the third paper on the invasive yet viable snow crab, the arguments focus primarily on spatial distribution of the stock and legal delimitations, the strength of user rights, and equity considerations with respect to marine conservation. So here we're asking, for example, the question of whether a single nation has the right to exclude others from marine conservation of international resources. Across Inuit Nunangat in Canada, there is a complex co-management system where federal, provincial, and territorial governments, alongside with Inuit organizations, work cooperatively towards sound marine resource management. And Nunatsiavut, where my project was focused at the time, is an area of about 120,000 kilometers of land and sea that's inhabited by only 2,500 people. who are mostly of Inuit origin, and they're scattered across these 5 communities you can see on the map to the left. It is located at the northern tip of the Newfoundland and Labrador province, and it is the first Inuit region in Canada to achieve self-government. And it remains the only Indigenous self-government in Atlantic Canada to date. So the indicators of relevance for these communities are unique compared to where much of the indicators' work has been applied before. And the differences are to a large extent grounded in the difficulties associated with the geographically challenged locations of these communities. And those are resulting in high expenses of ongoing data collection and monitoring, as well as the presence of and the importance of an Inuit knowledge system and the difficulties in properly accounting for this in indicator development and use. And here are 2 related papers where we delve more into these data poor fisheries and using some bioeconomic modeling for management recommendations. So just to give you the general framework of how this work emerged, the idea here has been that under the land claim agreements, Inuit knowledge and Western science are to be used side by side to support decision making. However, the mechanisms of integrating these knowledge systems to inform decision making remain poorly understood. So this limits Inuit self-determination and also improvements to resource governance, and it also exacerbates communication barriers, leading to tensions in marine resource management and also triggering feelings of inequity. So in general, as part of this project, we focus on indicators, positioning them as boundary objects around which different knowledge system converge. And this idea of boundary objects may be a concept that's more familiar to the sociologists and the anthropologists in the room. But the idea here of our work is that we've explored the role of these indicators, not only for monitoring ecosystems, but also for measuring knowledge integration into co-management. These indicators can facilitate knowledge co-production by translating knowledge across boundaries between different knowledge holders and enable cross-cultural communication and collaboration for improved marine resource management. In the fisheries economics literature, there has been an ever-growing number of indicators to measure landing values, profitability, employment, and whatnot. And some of them are drawing from the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So these are some of the indicators we identify at first as relevant and started looking at first. However, a lot of these indicators have been based on southern fisheries, which face very different conditions compared to the ones in the north. And most importantly, they hardly ever include equity indicators. And that's largely because economics has traditionally focused on efficiency rather than equity dimension. And that includes economics, fisheries economics, despite our acknowledgement in our profession that distribution of fisheries rights has been a major issue. Nevertheless, here we argue that industry profitability indicators are not enough to capture socioeconomic welfare or well-being. And I've written a bit more about this specifically for an Arctic marine indigenous context in this recent paper that came out in PLOS Climate. So the process of coming up with these equity indicators was not simple. So after having defined the relevant indicators, we started collecting local knowledge to select the right ones and make sure they're in line with local feelings of equity and fairness. And for that, we had to run some focus groups with those coastal communities and do some interviews with key regional stakeholders. So I ran 2 workshops in the communities of Nain and Makovic, which are the 2 most active communities in commercial fisheries, with a pilot workshop preceding these 2. And I found that fisheries management and decision making are way too fragmented. and that communication channels are largely missing between fisheries in Oceans Canada, the Newfoundland and Labrador province, the Nunavut government, the Torquay Joint Fisheries Board that advises the government for fisheries management, as well as the fisheries and processing industry, including the designates and beneficiaries. So this lack of collective approach creates barriers to capturing the social and economic benefits that commercial fisheries have the potential to produce. And let me dig a little more into the case studies themselves. I made this map here to depict the 4 main commercial fisheries and their fisheries management areas. And these are the snow crab, the Arctic char, the northern shrimp, and the turbot or Greenland halibut, and less so the Icelandic scallop. Despite the fact that there's a land claim agreement in place since 2005 that establishes access rights to Inuit to adjacent marine resources. So there's basically a designated zone, the LISA zone, the Labrador Inuit settlement area. The access to the fisheries turns out not always to be that straightforward. So with that objective in mind, we examine different dimensions with respect to socioeconomic benefits from fisheries in Nunavut, and we found that people feel that the allocations to fisheries are largely inequitable. And specifically that has to do a lot with the allocation of the Greenland halibut or the turbot, for which they get only 3.38% of the total Canadian allocation. And they also get about 10% only of the allocations of northern shrimp to their adjacent waters in shrimp fishing areas 4 and 5. And then when it comes to Arctic char, which is an important commercial and culturally important as well fishery, there's been big problems with respect to science. The char quotas are basically, for many years now, they're set arbitrarily. They're basically rolling over the same management plans since the early 90s, and that's because funding for science was largely interrupted, so that there's a big gap in long-term studies. We don't necessarily know what the stocks look like, the distribution, the structure, or the dynamics of the fishery. And then there's also a problem with communication to local fisheries and stakeholders with respect to any science activities. For example, seismic activities are not communicated on time to the fishermen operating in the region. And then there's issues tied to entry of new fishers under the communal fisheries management, meaning that there's limited financial independence to local fishers, and this lack of independence also creates a disincentive for capacity development to compete with other fleets in the region. And last, there's the problem of access to markets, because as you can imagine, this is a very geographically challenged and remote Indigenous region that does not have a sufficient infrastructure network, meaning that there are increased costs and decreased quality of the delivered seafood product when you're trying to reach the markets. So you're facing that competition as well. Now, despite the federal government's commitments, there is a failure to recognize Indigenous rights in fisheries and respect the adjacency principles, the economic viability and dependence on marine resources. So decision-making in Canada still allows for ministerial discretion, with fisheries management remaining driven by objectives in Ottawa that largely differ from the socioeconomic objectives of these Inuit communities. So it's important to be able to capture inequality for these reasons, and there's tools and metrics for that. I won't go into any excess economic jargon on that, given the nature of this talk and the diverse audience today. But just to mention the theory of diminishing marginal utility. It tells us what? That $1 gained by fishery-dependent communities is worth more than $1 by rights holders in bigger provinces like Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, or others with more diversified economic opportunities. And that supports the argument for increased allocations that align with the land claims agreement, and also for increased support of the local processing capacity, which is currently lacking. It basically states how much of the total income in the economy has to be redistributed from high to low income agents for a fully egalitarian income distribution to follow. So again, to put it simply, the theory of diminishing marginal utility tells us what? $1 gained by the poor is worth more than $1 gained by the rich in terms of improving the quality of life, so that we should give more weight to new income gained by the poor compared to the rich. I promised that I wouldn't buzz your minds with too much technical jargon today, but I just briefly want to explain the general framework and the approach we took to address distributional equity in allocations. First off, it's important to recognize that perceptions and definitions of equity differ among scholars, as we already know in this group, and also across practitioners, managers, and resource users. One neat approach that I personally like is that of Armstrong and Clark in the late 90s, who distinguished into 3 different equity dimensions within a utilitarian framework. And those were the equal access, the equal resource management, and the equal average products. Now, just as perceptions and definitions for equity matter and differ across all these stakeholders and users, so do the ways of measuring inequalities, such as income inequalities, for example. Examples of the most commonly used inequality measurement frameworks include the Lorenz curve or Gini coefficient, which many of you may have heard about. And also generalized entropy measures such as the tail index, the Atkinson index, and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, the Robin Hood or Hoover-Pietra index, and ratios such as the decile dispersion, the Palma and 2020 ratio. So it is reasonable to expect, of course, that some of these inequality measures may be highly correlated. However, there are empirical studies finding that the choice of the inequality metric does lead to a noticeable difference. And now in the fisheries context, and you can read in more detail about it in our paper on the application, the usefulness of each of these indicators, there has been a focus on distributional impacts of management schemes, such as quotas, for example, and also a focus on efficiency versus equity trade-offs and rights-based management tools, such as individual transferable quotas. As I said, you can take a look at more details on what these indicators include. But what comes out as a key message from our work in this paper is that it's important to be using multiple indicators to be able to capture these disparities among participants and definitions of equity. I'll just briefly explain now those the most commonly used indicators in fisheries, and which is first and foremost the Gini coefficient that measures income inequality, but it has severe limitations in the sense that it doesn't really reflect very well the distribution patterns in the income distribution, so that Gini, the index values remain pretty much similar, and there's sensitivity mainly towards the middle of the distribution. So it's not a great tool when we see inequalities on the top or on the bottom of the distribution. And then there's the HHI index, which addresses, it has the capacity of addressing, unlike the Gini coefficient, the number of participants and the inequality in the quota share. So it's suitable for indicating market concentration. And then there's the Taylor and Atkinson indices that offer sensitivity to the tails of the distribution that are able to give us information about inequalities within groups and between groups. We discussed the current distribution of quotas for the turbot or Greenland halibut and the northern stream fisheries among different stakeholder groups in order to characterize what distributional equity may look like. So this type of equity analysis would normally require knowing the number of fishers and the households connected to these fishers who benefit from the allocation to its group. Now, in the absence of this information for our case study and the lack of any relevant considerations justifying the current allocations, we first try to describe what an equal distribution would look like an equal allocation in the sense of a uniform distribution of quotas among the different stakeholder groups in its fishery. So that was our starting point, and of course that has limitations. We did not account for heterogeneity among these groups and their capacity to access the resource. And this becomes important, especially because for the turbot fishery, you get allocations shared among different fleet sectors. Nevertheless, Fisheries and Oceans Canada does not account for these differences either. So we rest reassured that this is a good enough starting point. And then we also assume that all stakeholder groups, they face identical prices. And we therefore use the quota allocations to each stakeholder groups in tons to estimate the distributional equity metrics. And again, this is a key simplifying assumption which allows us to ignore, for the purpose of this exercise, any disparities in income generated from the fisheries to the different stakeholder groups. In reality, though, some fishers may be getting a lower price than others, depending on how far away they are from the markets. And some background, and for some background information, unlike other indigenous groups such as in Nunavut and Nunavik, Nunatsiavut Inuit are not the primary beneficiaries of their adjacent marine resources, and so the local joint fisheries board has been advising for several years now for an increase in the allocation of turbot quotas based on equity claims. So we started off to back up and analyze those equity claims with an IO analysis. An input-output analysis involves economic multipliers, which are applied to illustrate the comprehensive economic contributions beyond fisheries value. So they're basically commonly used to illustrate the linkages of the fish production industry. And they're a factor by which one can multiply the value of the final demand for the output of the fishing or any other economic activity to illustrate how it contributes to the total economic output. So using these multipliers is important to be able to capture not only the direct impacts of the fishing activity, with national accounts report, but also the indirect and induced impacts, which if we leave aside, then this may understate the contribution of the fishing industry to the economy. So the direct impacts include the production of fisheries or the landed value, for example, income, employment, taxes, expenditure associated to operations of harvesting and processing. So that could include, for example, employees, contractors, service providers, and so on. Indirect impacts arise from the changes in all these aforementioned categories that occur in backward linked industries. So, for example, suppliers to processing. And last, induced impacts measure the changes in household demands or the value of production induced by a change in household income. So, for example, increased expenditure because there's a higher wage available in the household. So these households are linked to the fishing industry either directly through employment in the harvesting or processing sector, or indirectly by these backward linked industries to harvesting or processing. So the change in household income are generated from either direct or indirect impact. So, and again, why do we use those? So in trying to administer the requests from all these different stakeholder groups for changes in allocations of multiple fisheries, considering the economic impact of each fishery separately may prove useful in adjusting these allocations to achieve the desired socioeconomic goals. And then we pick up on the Atkinson Index, which accounts for society's aversion to inequality. And it can be used for better understanding the implications of socioeconomic welfare from alternative policy options. It captures the overall welfare loss to society resulting from an unequal distribution. Typically, people use it to assess economic impacts of policies across different incomes. And overall, this metric depends on the degree to which society is averse to inequality, which is reflecting through a weighting parameter called epsilon, known as the inequality aversion parameter. So basically, higher values of epsilon indicate a larger social utility or people's willingness to accept smaller incomes in exchange for a more equal distribution. While a declining epsilon makes it more sensitive to changes in the upper end of the distribution. So in our case of the turbot or Greenland Hollywood fishery, a moderate inequality aversion of, say, 0.5 yields an Atkinson value of 0.376. And what does that mean? That means that 37.6% of the total income could be sacrificed in order to have equal incomes. Or, better put, it is the fraction of income that could be sacrificed without reducing social welfare if income were equally distributed. Or you can think of it the opposite way and subtract from 100% and say 62.4% of the present income would be required to realize the same social welfare if it were equally distributed. And then we further examine these four allocation scenarios for this fishery, illustrating the table to be able to show the shifts in the Atkinson inequality metric. And then we estimate, as you can see in the table, the outcomes of the varying degrees of inequality aversion from medium to strong aversion, so up till 2, a value of epsilon of 2, and an epsilon of 0, for example, means that society is indifferent between transfers between any two entities, or society gains no utility at all by complete redistribution of income or resources that results in a 0 Atkinson index. So for an increasingly unequal distribution, or as epsilon approaches infinity, meaning that society places more weights on transfer to entities with lower income or resources, the Atkinson value approaches 1. So this means that complete redistribution of income or resources leads to infinite social utility gain. So therefore, under certain conditions of society's inequality aversion, lower values of the Atkinson index point at a more equal distribution compared to higher values. Now, unfortunately, in this case, we didn't have information on the income distribution of fishers, but if we did, it would have been possible to compare the outcomes for scenarios of allocations using different inequality aversion weights. So in the absence of this information, we ended up using household incomes in Canada. So the table here shows in the first column the income quantiles for the household income in Canada for 2016, along with the Atkinson index values for varying degrees of inequality aversion. And the main assumption behind this metric is that marginal utility of income is diminishing across groups with increasing median income. So inequality can then be expressed relative to the marginal utility of median income for all stakeholders, so that the welfare gains or losses to low income groups are weighted more heavily relative to the median, and the opposite holds for the high income groups. And as an example, consider that fisheries in one stakeholder category, to which Fisheries and Oceans Canada allocates the turbot quota, belongs to the lowest quantile, while the rest of the stakeholder groups are average income holders. So in this example, we will be assuming that those fishing under the Nunatsiavut government license are the ones in the poorest ones, the ones in the lowest income quantile. So what you're seeing here is the local and total welfare in terms of value produced from fisheries. And what that would look like if, say, the turbot fisheries under the Nunatsiavut government's communal license are in the lowest income quantile, while all other fisheries are in the third income quantile. So the ratio of weights for the lowest to the left quantile compared to the highest quantile increased from 1 to 1 when epsilon is 0 to 1.75 when epsilon is 0.25 and up to 9 when epsilon is 1, and may reach up to 130 when epsilon is 2, which is the most extreme level of inequality aversion in this example. So this type of analysis brings to surface the effects of allocations, which are distributionally weighted. And decisions on ways of allocating an increase in total allowable catch would then need to factor in the magnitude of distributional weights. So the total welfare is higher when the increase in total allowable catch is allocated exclusively to the Nunatsiavut government, compared to distributing it across all stakeholders according to their predetermined shares in the fishery. Notice, however, that with increasing inequality aversion, the difference between the two allocation mechanisms becomes larger. Now, taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture of you can still hear me, right? Okay, good. Now, yes, taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture of equity issues in northern fisheries, as oceans absorb a large share of the world's additional heat, we see fish stocks increasingly moving poleward to colder waters. So this shifting distribution results in gains in fishing opportunities for some fisheries and losses in others. And while attention has focused on how these gains and losses within fisheries affect the distribution share between countries in, say, transboundary stocks and whatnot, strategies to manage these shifts domestically within nations have generally received less attention in the fisheries literature. So in this paper, we do this from an equity angle again, looking at different case studies and putting more emphasis in northern ecosystems on the mackerel that recently appeared in Iceland, and on the northern shrimp in the Canadian Arctic, whose abundance has changed as a result of climate change, and not only abundance, but also the distribution. And we argue that governments of fishing nations should be considering how such potential gains from shifts can be fairly and transparently distributed. And preferably, they should be doing that proactively, so before these new fishing opportunities arise. So in the past, fishing opportunities have most often been allocated on the basis of historical fishing track records. However, such a legacy, as we call it, approach to harvest rights is a contentious issue in fisheries management and research. And that's because initial allocation of individual quotas is often done at early stage of the development of a fishery, including at a time when the industry is not highly profitable, and the quotas are often freely gifted to the industry participants. However, over time, inefficient resource users are typically incentivized to sell their harvesting rights and cash out, while the remaining participants consolidate and become more profitable, while overcapacity is reduced, especially if the stocks are restored and the cost of fishing goes down. And then the increased profitability of those that remain in the industry can spark public debate regarding the initial free allocation of harvest rights. So this contention stems from the perception that the state, to some extent, forgoes its entitlement to the resource rent, an economic benefit that could otherwise belong to the public instead of private actors. And instead, it is the fishers who receive the initial free allocation who obtain the resource rents as gains. Moreover, future generations may lose the opportunity to generate income from a resource after access is restricted and allocated. And then another issue with the approach is the problem that quotas are gifted only to those who own vessels. So this means that those working on the vessels or in the processing industry are not directly compensated if the vessel owner decides to sell their quota, for example. In addition to that, this legacy approach also incentivize a behavior called fishing for history, where companies increase catch amounts in the years before the implementation of a new quota system, which has been proven to be harmful to the environment and may benefit some companies more than others, meaning, for example, in expectation of the new quota system, there's a bit of an over-harvesting in advance of that. And just so you get a flavor of what allocations look like globally, the figure on the top shows where fishing opportunities are generally allocated to individuals or groups of individuals, such as cooperatives in the Northeast US. The figure on the bottom shows where fishing opportunities are generally allocated for fixed periods of time, and that may reduce the urgency for anticipatory governance of new fishing opportunity in those locations versus the indefinite allocations in systems in the figure in the middle, for example. I don't have much time today to go into more detail about the case studies upon which we're building this, but I'll just give the key takeaway messages of our analysis. So for some new fishing opportunities, there is no precedent, such as, for example, the mackerel that appeared in recent years in Iceland. And when we get shifts in abundance, like we saw in the case of the Northern Stream in Canada, if there is no criteria or allocation principles based on equity in place already, then this can cause tension and feelings of inequity. And this is why we argue that fishing nations need to be prudent and establish a transparent and equitable framework before these new opportunities emerge, and engage stakeholders well in advance before these shifts. Article 17 of the EU's Common Fisheries Policies, for example, could offer an example of criteria for reallocation that work towards achieving some preset objectives, because it requires, for example, EU member states to allocate fishing opportunities using transparent social, environmental, and economic criteria. And those could, for example, be stability for fishers, capacity to use the quota fully, the ability for new entrants to enter the industry, good environmental performance, also social performance and revenue generation, to cover the quota shortages or compensate historically disenfranchised fishers and whatnot. And over to the last component of my talk that relates to the appearance of a new invasive species in the Barents Sea and the equity angles that arise from rights distributions there. At first, the assumption was that the snow crab in the Barents Sea was an accidental introduction. And then a series of studies started getting published, providing evidence, genetic evidence, albeit a little loose, that the snow crab had expanded its natural habitat over from the Far East, meaning essentially that it had walked all this way. Due to climate change, and that it established successfully in the Barents Sea, perhaps aided by climate change, but we can not be sure about that. However, the introduction pathway matters on how we deal with the invasion, included from a conservation equity angle. And that's because it creates responsibility to deal with the invasion as a pest and try and eliminate its presence and its spread to try and protect the global common good of Arctic biodiversity. And that's especially true under commitments and environmental agreements such as the CBD, the Convention for the Biological Diversity, and also more recently the BBNJ potentially. To try and manage this for an invasion rather than manage it for a profitable fishery. The other thing that matters a lot in this discussion is whether we're talking about a sedentary resource or not. The designation of the snow crab as a sedentary resource means that while Norway asserts the Svalbard continental shelf and the fisheries protection zone to be theirs to manage and benefit from, others contest this view through the 1920 Svalbard Treaty. And this treaty recognized Norwegian sovereignty over the area, while it simultaneously assures equal access and treatment of the signatory parties for commercial activities and natural resource extraction. But the big controversy comes from the fact that sedentary species include other valuable resources such as oil and gas. So the property rights conflicts, as many of the lawyers in the room may know, already come from those interests in natural resources rather than the snow crab fishery itself. So in this work, we analyze the management of the fishery in a strength of user rights context in the emerging Barents snow crab fishery. And specifically, we look at security, exclusivity, and durability of fishing rights. And we examine those at a regional and national level within Norway, at an international level, and as a factor of ecological details. And it is this last dimension of the ecological details that I want to emphasize today, as it has stronger ties to equity and also in the interest of time. So there's mixed evidence regarding the snow crab's ecological impacts, and that underscores the urgency to refine our understanding of its ecological role. And these ambiguities send mixed messages to the fisheries stakeholders, and it's complicating the reinforcement of strong user rights in fisheries. And the fact that this ecological research takes a lot of time, it means that if significant ecological damages are found, not only are vulnerable Arctic habitats at risk, but future fishery investments may also face uncertainty, especially if measures are needed to mitigate impacts and manage snow crab populations accordingly, with negative ecological impacts in mind. So this scenario stresses the importance of cautious and informed management decisions in the face of ecological uncertainties. And so in addressing the complexities of the snow crab fishery within the framework of ecological uncertainties, the current management practices and the current management practices that do not account for these ecological impacts, there's several critical questions coming up. And it's important to evaluate the sustainability of Norway's fishing levels against the backdrop of the snow crab distribution, especially considering that Norway doesn't systematically survey the population all across the area of distribution. So this evaluation is critical in determining the capacity of new entrants in the fishery, especially EU vessels, to contribute to managing or reducing the stock to an ecologically sustainable level, considering the invasion losses. So the potential inclusion of possibly more cost-effective EU vessels that are currently excluded from the fishery begs a re-evaluation of strong user rights to possibly widen access beyond Norwegian vessels, thereby addressing both efficiency of limiting the snow crab's population and spread and the economic dynamics of the fishery. So in this context, understanding the proximity of the current harvest levels to the MSY maximum sustainable yield or the maximum economic yield can help clarify the potential for expanding the fishery to include more participants. And this analysis becomes even more important when considering the ecological impacts of the invasion on these calculations, as I'm trying to show in this figure for the economists in the room. So we're referring to expansion of non-Norwegian actors because despite a significant increase and interest from Norwegian companies to fish for the snow crab, the ones that are actually actively fishing, there are less than 20 vessels. So answering how the inclusion of ecological damages from the invasion might change the maximum sustainable yield or maximum economic yield calculations becomes very important in this context. Because should the ecological losses be substantial, it may necessitate, this may require a reduction in the optimal stock levels. And conversely, if we find that there's very low damages, then that could support a higher stock level. And I should emphasize here before closing this presentation that this is not the first time for Norway trying to manage an invasion with a simultaneous role as a profitable commodity and as an invasion nuisance. I've spent a good amount of my time and my career studying the management of the Barents Sea red king crab. And the reason why I think it's super important to dig more into these fisheries/invasions is because we see an increasing number of invasions with multiple roles, and particularly in the Arctic, with managers looking increasingly into these two cases of invasive crabs for lessons learned, and those are not necessarily success stories, speaking from an insider's perspective, if I may. And specifically, the equity angle is not one that has been assessed in this fisheries invasive species context. So there's an opportunity for some new messages to emerge through this analysis. And that's what I have for today, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melina. It was very interesting and inspiring. It is a different case study, and this whole reflection based on it about the justice and equity in sharing resources. So now we will take some question. Is there someone?